So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about the economics of solar power. When will solar power make sense for your business? Before we get going, we just want to thank some contributors ahead of today's presentation. The Calgary area microgenerators, as well as PNUC Solar, the Renewable Energy Cooperative as well. Just to kind of go through what we're going to be kind of covering off today, we're starting off today's presentation by, we'll let you know a little bit about who 360 Energy is, as well as a little bit about our presenter today and what he's going to be talking about. And then we'll start off with a really quick poll before getting into the presentation today. A few things, just kind of housekeeping things as well. During the presentation today, everyone will be on mute. If you do have a question that comes up that you think of the presentation, you can please feel free to write that in the chat area in the webinar function area. Or you can, we will unmute everybody right at the end, and we'll actually kind of go through and see if anybody has any questions they want as well. So, a little bit about 360 Energy. 360 Energy has been involved in energy management and energy management consulting for the last 24 years. Our approach is to help customers manage their energy and energy costs by focusing on building a culture of energy management and organization. In order to see sustainable utility costs and savings through continuous improvement approach. So as we all know, the energy sector is pretty complex for customers as it is influenced and controlled by external factors beyond customers' control. The factors increase control within the energy supply chain, and those factors directly impact control within a customer's own facility. 360 Energy aims to help our customers understand all the impacts and influences in order to control energy costs and make good decisions. So in keeping with that approach, today we're very fortunate to have Mike Johnson from the National Energy Board, otherwise known as the NEB, discussing the economics of solar power today. Mike, I'm not sure where his picture went. Mike is the technical leader of the energy supply team at the NEB. He'll be discussing a few basics about solar power, and we'll get into discussing some of the tools available from the NEB to help Canadians figure out the economics based on a number of key factors. So to get started, we just have a quick poll that we want to get everybody to fill out. So this is just basically here's kind of looking at today. So a lot of people might be, looking at solar for their business, their a larger industry, small business. You could be a supplier and installer. We're just kind of interested in seeing kind of who all is here today and what, where those interests lie. So we'll reveal those poll results at the end of the presentation a little bit later. So I'll just give everybody a few more minutes, and you can absolutely pick more than one option on that. Okay, we're going to close that poll off in just a second here for participating in that. So, without any further ado, I am going to hand this over to Mike Johnson. And I'm just going to bear with me for a second here, and we'll hand things over to him to get us started on today's presentation. One second here, Mike. We'll make sure that you're able to be heard here. All right, Mike, you should be unmuted. Sorry about the technical difficulties there for a moment.
That's okay. Just want to confirm everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you, Mike.
Okay, that's great. I can get started. Okay, so just going to start off by saying that this was a pretty high-level report. We looked at solar across the country in a lot of communities, and so one thing to keep in mind about in all of this is that, what the numbers we give may change locally, what some things, what some costs we applied in places like Ontario or Alberta or Saskatchewan, they can change depending upon where you are. Because again, this was a high level look. To get down into the granularity of, what it costs at every site could be difficult. Well, actually really difficult. So we really did look at it from very high level. So another thing to get across, I know we mostly, the National Energy Board, we're mostly in the news because we regulate oil and gas pipelines. That's not all that we do. We actually have an energy information side of the business. That is, we put out publications, two examples on the screen, Canada's renewable power landscape, nuclear energy in Canada. We also do long-term projections of energy supply and demand in Canada for 25 years or so. So just keep that in mind. The project of the solar report we did is based on this energy information program. And the big goal behind this has now evolved over the past 5 years or so. It's to help Canadians make informed choices about energy. And Canadians can be very broad. It can be homeowners, it can be people in the commercial sector, it can be policymakers, it can be other regulators. It's a pretty broad thing, but that's the goal now. And so the solar report was really kind of aimed at residential homeowners. It was aimed at business owners or people who run community centers, and as well it touched on utility scale, which really gets into the heart of what policymakers may also be thinking. So the point of this whole thing was to inform Canadians if solar power makes financial sense for them. Again, very high level, but it's a starting point. It really will hopefully get some people talking about whether it makes sense for them or not. And if they're curious, it gives them a starting point, and then they can maybe go talk to some other people, a professional or something like that. We did this in several different ways. We had different scales. If you look over the right-hand side here, residential, commercial, community, utility with a fixed mount, utility with a tracker mount. So we looked at it from a whole bit different size of arrays, from 5 kilowatts up to 50 megawatts. But we also looked at installation costs now, like 2018, or sorry, I guess not 2018 now, but we looked at it from the perspective of 2018 installation out 5 or 10 years or so, knowing that those 5 or 10 years, costs could fall faster than we expect, or they could fall slower than we expect. And then we also looked at things like market pricing, which is a really big deal these days, right? If you're paying a fixed rate on your utility bill, or if you're paying, something through a smart meter which tracks your use by time of day. And it really, this market pricing thing makes a pretty big impact, and I will talk about that. It's actually one of the neater things about solar from a residential and commercial standpoint. And really created this whole analysis, created a giant data set that says how much you'll generate at each site and what is the break-even electricity price. And really the break-even electricity price is when you look at how much it costs to install the solar setup, how much it costs to run it, and then it figures out, well, what's the price of electricity that is generated by that solar array. very generally. One really important thing to keep in mind through all of this, I just kind of started this off at the very beginning. Every array and site is different. And it comes down to, depending on how big your array is, it can be what panels you use on your array, because some panels generate electricity differently than others. So just because, I'll go back a bit. So that some panels perform better in low light conditions than other panels. So really, the panels you choose matter. And then you have the size of your array, but also things that matter are things like where you set them up, because shading obviously reduces solar, the amount of light your panels receive. Where your panels face, do they face due south? Do they face southwest? And the slope too really matters, because if the better the panel is pointed at the sun, it means it's probably going to generate more electricity. And also things like soiling and snow, that if you have any grime on your panels or snow on your panels, you're going to reduce the amount of the amount of sunlight your panels receive. So you have all these uncertainties in how panels perform. But then, so that's kind of like a performance perspective, but then also your motives matter as well. And I'm thinking a motive in terms of why are you putting these on your house or for your business. If this is to try and save money, that's one motive. The other motive, of course, is environmental. Are you interested in reducing your greenhouse gas costs or greenhouse gas emissions? We didn't look at it that way in this report. It becomes a lot more complicated to do something like that. We really kept it on this report on the side of whether solar might help you save money or not on your electricity bill. But a lot of people will install solar on their rooftops or for their businesses just to reduce their GHG emissions. And really importantly, at its very bottom again, it really depends where you're located, what setup you use, and because of this, always talk to a professional before you decide to do anything. Get a site assessment before you decide to do anything. This report is based on some assumptions that are generic, spread across the country. Locally, things change, your installation costs change. So on every rooftop changes depending upon whether it's shaded, where it's getting some shading from trees or not. So always talk to a pro. So the scale of this thing was really across Canada. We looked at this from the West Coast all the way to the East Coast. We included First Nation and Métis communities. We have Canadian Armed Forces stations in there, and also generating stations as well. So we really wanted a big picture across Canada, but there's actually a lot of fine-grained details in there. 20,000 communities in all. It gives a pretty good idea overall about how solar will perform across the country. And we even, and this map doesn't show up, but we even go all the way, we included Alert or Eureka, the northernmost station in Canada kind of thing, way up north in the Arctic archipelago, just to make sure that was covered, because it's a pretty far north place. The data we used behind this, it was nice. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the United States, they have a gridded solar data set that has hourly data for a typical meteorological year for everywhere in North America and other places in the world up to the 60th parallel. So anywhere a community was located down through here, we could get hourly, a typical, what kind of sunlight they get hourly or for every hour of the year. And so it made it possible to get some really great fine-grained specifics on how solar performs at times of day, which made it possible to look at time of use, again, how those smart meters play into things. And this is just a typical meteorological year. That's every hour. They have historical data from 1998 to 2017, I think. I think it's 2017 now, on every half hour. So there's a great data set they have from the NREL that helped provide the data for most of this report. For areas north of the 60th parallel, we relied on what limited ground stations that Environment Canada had. And so really we were limited to 3 places in Yukon, a few places in the Northwest Territories, and I think 11 or so in Nunavut. So that the data is much more sparse in the north in terms of what our solar assessment did, where in the south, because we have all this data, we can have the 20,000 communities done. So just to get across again, how we looked at things, we looked at different scales. So we looked at residential at a 5 kilowatt size. That's about average for what a Canadian home is. We looked at commercial and community, making them 200 kilowatts each. The difference between commercial is commercials for business. Community is something that would be like a nonprofit. Say if you wanted, and the assumption behind this in the community was that you say you use solar panels to help with the nonprofit community center in things like heating a pool, using electricity to heat a pool, or to help, with a hockey rink or something like that. But really, because commercial and community are different. Community, you're really not looking at any taxes, where commercial, you do have some taxes. So there is a difference in there. On the big side of things, we looked at utility scale. So 50 megawatt utility scale solar farm with a fixed mount. That is, right, the panels are fixed in place and don't change. And then we also looked at the tracker mount. That is, the panels can rotate on a hinge to better face the sun in the sky. There are none in Canada yet, but one of the interesting findings of the study is that there's actually tracker mounts. Yeah, maybe they should be considering them for Canada. There's a significant improvement for what little extra cost there is to install them. Hopefully I'll get to that today as well. Basic assumptions we used: panels face due south. In this assessment, that's what we assumed. Again, if you're putting these on your business or you're putting these things on a home, it really changes. Not every rooftop faces directly south. When you're putting these on the ground for a business or on a roof for a business or something, you're not going to be able to face things directly south all the time. So this was a simplifying assumption we used. For the trackers on the utility scale, we assumed that the panels could rotate plus or minus 45 degrees from like the 0 degrees. So they could rotate 45 degrees in one direction and then 45 degrees in the other, for a total of about 90 degrees in total rotation. And then we used the SunPower SPR 315E panel. This was, we chose this one based on a report that was done by Christopher Clark and in Nature somewhere. That they use this as their type panel for a big North America or U.S. look at renewable energy and how it integrates. We use the same panel. It's 19% efficient, so it's slightly more efficient than most current models, just slightly. A lot of the good panels coming up these days are like 18%. So it's just a bit more efficient, but it should give a good idea of what's going on. So the model, it basically puts out generation over a 1-year period for every hour. And then, of course, we can do this over what a life of a solar farm or a solar array is, whether it's a farm or on your roof. We just extended that out to 25 years to determine the economics of it. Importantly, the power generation that comes out of it, we call it marketable power. Really, that's your clean panel, subtracting some losses. So you lose some from soiling, so dirt, snow, and also to convert DC to AC, because a panel will generate things in direct current, but it needs to be turned into alternating current before it can be used in a home or in a business or put on to a transmission system, unless actually that transmission system is a DC transmission system. But we just converted everything to AC. And we included an annual performance degradation there of about 0.5%, so that every year performance would degrade by 0.5%. That's a standard for how most panels perform. So we have the different sizes of arrays again, the residential through utility, 5 kilowatts to 50 megawatts. But to understand kind of the economics, you need to know how much it costs to install these things. So we looked again, current installation cost. Current was 2018. That's more or less what it was. Near future was projected out based on some historical data from the NREL, and same with the low-cost future. We projected it out based on historical data. These could be near future, could be 5 years from now. Low-cost future could be 10 years from now. In all reality, near future could end up being 2 years from now, and low cost could be 5 years from now. It really depends how fast installation costs for solar keep falling. They've been falling very fast in the recent past. Does that keep happening? I don't know. It's really hard to predict the future. But anyway, so we did look at these. So residential drops, we assumed it would drop from about $3.20 per watt now, or in 2018, to $2.25 in a low-cost future. Commercial and community installations from $2.20 down to about $1.50 in a low-cost future. Utility about $1.45. It cuts in half down to 75 cents in a low-cost future, and same with the utility tracker amount. $1.55 drops down to 80 cents in the low-cost future. So we're trying to get what we want to do is not capture what it costs now, but what it might be like in the future, because not everyone's you might look at something what it says today. Oh well, it doesn't make sense to install it today. But if you look at that near future installation or low-cost future, say, maybe 5 years, maybe it'll make sense then. And then it's time to look at it again. So just to give an idea of what happens. And it also helps to do this kind of thing, because then it helps give an idea from a projection standpoint of electricity supply that, okay, if it doesn't make sense now, but does make sense in 5 years from now, when we do things like project electricity supply in Canada's future, it ends up being, well, we might start seeing a lot of distributed electricity come online in 2025, 2030 or something like that, because all of a sudden the costs fall low enough to make things economic. So these things do help us. Okay, there's some finance stuff here. Not everybody is a finance person. I'm actually not a finance person. My background is actually in geology. But I've learned economics and to do some finance in order to make these things work. It actually really helps. Anyways, so the previous slide here, these were the costs to install the array in dollars per watt. But hey, it also costs money to run an array. And here we use maintenance. Really, this is just your operating costs of it. So $15 per kilowatt per year. So imagine a 5 kilowatt array on a home. 5 times 15, what's that? $75 a year, kind of thing. Okay, on a utility scale array, that's 50 megawatts. So obviously that maintenance on that is going to be much higher. But again, it all comes down to 15 kilowatts or $15 per kilowatt per year just to run the array. It's actually pretty low cost. That's the one thing about solar. Generally have low operating costs because you don't have any fuel costs. Some additional assumptions for the utility scale arrays that, basically you have to take your electricity and get it onto the grid. We assume that would be $4 per megawatt hour. Plus, we included in some scenarios grid tariffs, which I will talk about a little bit, probably, if I get time to. Really, tariffs are the cost of maintaining the grid. So things like new transmission lines, you might need some operating reserves in there somewhere just in case power goes down and you have to pull power from somewhere else. There are costs with having a grid. Those have to be accounted for in certain in many provinces. These are paid for by generators, which would include a utility scale solar farm. And also for utility scale, we did assume that the land was rented, and in some places rents were much higher than others. You can see in non-prime areas down to $450 an acre, but in Vancouver, hey, it's expensive to do anything in Vancouver. $5,000 an acre is what we assume there. That kind of thing. In the end, it doesn't make a huge difference in in the economics of utility scale solar, but I mean, if you can shave costs, there is sometimes locating yourself in a lower rent area can make sense for utility scale. The financial assumptions, real finance stuff, again, we assume that utility scale, the people who run a utility scale, they're probably going to want to earn a 10% rate of return. Whereas for residential, commercial, and community, you're actually not looking for a profit. You're just looking to straight break even kind of thing. So there are two different kind of motives here. And discount rates, we do this. We have to discount these future revenues because, of course, if you're considering putting in a solar array on your home or business, or you're doing it for a solar farm, you know, you can't always take that money and put it somewhere else. Or, you know, it costs to finance things. And so for utility scale and community and commercial, we base this on a financing kind of thing. How much would it cost to actually finance to put this on? Really, that's kind of like a loan amount. So about 5.75%. For residential, we just assumed that there's an opportunity cost to it. That is, I want to spend $15,000 to put an array on my rooftop. Well, because I think I'm going to save money. Well, you can always take that $15,000 and drop it into something like an income fund that can earn you maybe 5% rate of return as another way to save money. So this 5% for residential is actually an opportunity cost that you might push that money somewhere else. And so by doing this, we can look at, do the finance on it and, you know, discount future kind of, I guess, hard to call them revenues when you're doing it on top, when you have a solar array on top of your house. But we discount those future revenues because $1 in the future is worth less than $1 today, and we base that on these discount rates per year. And then, of course, there's always inflation. We just assume 2% annual. And again, this is important because, you know, $1 spent now is less than, or has more value than $1 spent in the future, thanks to inflation. So 1127. Another thing is that one thing that once you get this thing up, hourly pricing can matter too, right? Some people just have fixed rates. You pay the same rate for every hour of the day, every day of the week, for every kilowatt hour, every megawatt hour you consume. But once you start getting into things like smart meters, homes and businesses, and at the utility scale, if you're selling onto a grid, like Ontario and Alberta, where you have hourly electricity prices that you can earn, then, you know, this hourly pricing matters too, because it's based on generation, because it's based on demand. You have way more demand during daylight hours, simply because everybody's up and doing stuff. Businesses are running. In the summertime, you have lots of air conditioning demand, even heating demand in the winter, depending upon where you are. So demand changes over 24 hours. So therefore, and we have that hourly data thanks to the NREL. So we can look at how revenues are, or the value of the electricity that's generated, so that, you know, in the daytime hours, electricity has a higher value than overnight hours. And this works to solar's advantage because it's only generating electricity during daylight hours. And again, I'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a bit. And again, so this plays into if you have fixed prices you're paying or time of day prices. That is, again, if you have a smart meter, and this really depends upon where your smart meters are. You've got them in Ontario, you've got them coming in more in Nova Scotia, and trying to work them into New Brunswick. Some places have them in Alberta, but they're really not widely deployed yet. So, but we still looked at it, and we looked at them across what would happen if you did have smart meters in jurisdictions that don't have smart meters yet, just to see what would happen to the economics. So now I'm going to kind of go back and forth between the charts I have on the screen here and what I have in the in a big Tableau workbook. And the Tableau workbook is interactive, and this is what is, if you go to our website, I could provide an email address at the end of the presentation. If you go to their website and you go to the solar report, the interactive dashboards are all on the website, so you can actually find out things there by searching where you're located or just playing around on the graphics. And the big thing right away, solar power generation largely depends upon where you live. And I'm going to flip out of this right now. And I'm going to put this on my screen. And we're going to go to that same chart. Takes a second. Okay, there we go. So we were here on this slide. Now we're here as well. So when we look at electricity in how it's generated by solar, there we go. On our dashboard, again, you can find this graphic on our website. So we have residential, commercial at 200 kilowatts, and it'll show how much you can generate. So an array in the best place in Ontario at a commercial scale will generate about 296 megawatt hours per year. Manitoba, 292 megawatt hours per year. Again, utility fixed. Then you start getting up towards 73,000, so 73 gigawatt hours per year in the best place in Manitoba. Same thing, about 74 gigawatt hours in Scudder, Ontario, kind of thing. So you can play around on this and you can see what's good, what's not so good. Port Churchill, Manitoba, not a great place for solar. But this is just on this graphic. When you look at the map, you can see how the worst generation are the blues, the best generation are these deeper oranges. So you can see, kind of makes sense that in these West Coast areas where you get a lot of cloud cover, not a whole lot of generation. And it's about half of what you get in the best areas, which are like southernmost Ontario and in the very southern prairies. So again, it's about half. It's about half from the worst to the best. That's actually quite a range. And then you can even see in the north, there you get some generation up there that's not great. I will get into more detail about what this means later. It doesn't really necessarily matter where you are. It doesn't matter how much you generate, but what matters really is where you are and the prices you pay for electricity. I will get into that. But you can see, you can play on the map and see what different communities are. You can zoom in and check out here. So in Lavenham, Manitoba, annual generation in the first year of an array, 72,000 megawatt hours for utility scale fixed amount. But for a home, in Miami, Manitoba, sure it's not as warm as the real Miami this time of year, but you're only looking at 6.9 megawatt hours generation for a residential scale array over 5 kilowatts. You can search. So I always like going to Niagara Falls. That's where I was born, or I wasn't born, but I was raised there. What you can do is then look, we here have Niagara Falls, and we can see a typical array in Niagara Falls would generate about 6.7 megawatt hours of electricity. For a residential array, if it was commercial, it would be 272 megawatt hours. So anyway, so you can browse the results like this. It's just a handy feature that, depending upon where you are, just go and look and find out specifics for your community. That's what kind of makes this handy. So I'm going to go back out. So this shows, again, the generation. We're on the very kind of coast over here and on the west coast here. It's cloudy places, foggy places. You're not going to get a whole lot of sunlight, but in the interior of the country, that's where you get the best generation. I'll only talk about capacity factor. It really kind of matters for utility scale tariffs. But the idea is that this measures how well used your array is. So on a residential array, it's about its capacity factor is 16%. So the entire capacity of the array, you get about 16% or 17% of generation out of that, kind of in the best cases. And that just really comes down to, right, you can only generate electricity during daylight hours. Most of the time, your array is not generating electricity. It can be cloudy, which further reduces how much electricity your array can generate. So solar tends to have a low capacity factor. This is compared to things like a nuclear power plant, which they tend to run over 80% of the time at full capacity, which means their capacity factors tend to be 80% or above, right? Now, hydro, well above 50% because they do tend to run most of the time. Solar is relatively low in comparison. But overall, again, right? So you have not so good places to generate electricity in Canada, and you have some good places to generate electricity in Canada. It really depends upon where you're located. Next slide. Financial break-evens. So we just looked at here, right? The generation largely depends upon where you live. Financial break-evens depend upon where you live, but also on provincial taxes and whether you have smart meters. And so I'm just going to go over to the commercial scale thing here. Make sure I get this right. Okay, so the break-even prices, and I'm just going to zoom in here to the provinces. Okay, so the top graph up here, this is the break-even price. So as at a commercial scale, make sure I get this right. Yep, commercial scale. So for a business, right, at the cost to install an array now, and using that fixed rate, you're looking at anywhere in Canada from about 10 cents per kilowatt hour to 21 cents per kilowatt hour. Some places are better than others. The dark blue areas, they're high, so those are not so good, right? Here in northern Quebec, you're looking at 20 cents per kilowatt hour generation. Down in southern Alberta, you're looking at 10 cents, so about half of that. So again, where you are located in the country changes whatever your break-even price is for your array. But also, it really depends on the province you're in, because different sales taxes, right? In Alberta, there's a 5% sales tax that gets applied to installation. In Ontario, you're looking, I think, more to 13%, or is it 15%? Can't remember the exact number, but that gets added to the cost of installation. So whatever province you're in, sales taxes matter as well. So that makes arrays better in Alberta for pure break-even price than they would for the same amount of sunlight you might get in Ontario. So there are some advantages to that. Places with high sales taxes makes installing solar less economic. And it's the same thing with businesses as it is with, so you get the residential one up here. Same thing with businesses as with residential. It's like you get pricey electricity in some spots, cheaper electric break-evens in some spots from a residential array. And again, sales taxes matter there as well. So it's one thing to keep in mind. But make sure I get this right. Yeah. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And of course, as you go into the near future, your prices get cheaper. So for residential electricity, you're looking from about 13 cents per kilowatt hour to 27 cents per kilowatt hour. You move into the near future, hey, that's down to 22 cents, it's down to 10 cents and 22 cents. In the low-cost future, you're down to 9 cents and 20 cents. So in the future, as the cost to install solar keep falling, the economics look better and better. Go back to the commercial array, same thing here. Right now, for commercial scale, you're looking at about 10 cents per kilowatt hour to 21 cents, but in a low-cost future, that falls down to 7 cents and 16 cents. So things start looking better. I'm going to flip to the next slide. But that's just a strict break-even cost. That doesn't really go into things like whether it makes financial sense, because whether it makes financial sense to put in solar really depends upon the electricity prices you're otherwise paying. And we get some more graphics on here. I'll start with the commercial scale, go back to the current installation cost. This really depends. So these are the straight break-even prices. These are those break-even prices compared to the electricity price you're probably paying for on electricity. So what you see here, these maps look very different. What's not very economic is blue. Your break-even price is really high compared to your electricity price you're paying. On the other hand, orangish colors, what you're seeing here is your break-even price is low compared to your electricity price. So this is good. This is not so good. And what you see right away from a commercial perspective, different parts of the country light up differently. You have Ontario here, which is pretty orange. It would suggest that most places in Ontario, it makes sense to install commercial solar on your business, you know, right now, at a fixed rate, if you're paying a fixed rate. In southern Saskatchewan, it's about the same thing, but it's really close. It's almost completely even between what your break-even price is and what your electricity price is. It's very close. It's about the same. If you're in the Maritimes, let's zoom in on the Maritimes here, right? PEI, you know, it's pretty orange. Makes sense for commercial solar, makes sense there. And it starts making sense in a lot of places in Nova Scotia as well. Here, oh, sorry, didn't need to do that. Just trying to move my map over. Won't let me do it. So do that. Okay. It really depends where you're located, but big chunks of the country, it doesn't make a whole lot of financial sense for commercial. You know, all these blue areas, they tend to have cheap electricity. BC, hydro is cheap. Manitoba, hydro is cheap. Quebec, hydro is cheap. Newfoundland and Labrador, hydro is relatively cheap. So you're competing what you're paying from the grid for your electricity. You know, it's pretty inexpensive there, so it's hard for solar to make sense. In Canada's north, a lot of orange dots up there. That's really because the electricity is expensive. It tends to run off of things like diesel-fired power generation. So commercial solar makes sense up there. Not so much in Yukon. They actually have some pretty reasonable electricity prices there. They got hydro, of course. For residential, we see something similar. What we see right now is the places that make sense to install residential solar. Saskatchewan, pretty expensive electricity in Saskatchewan, and in the Maritimes in PEI. And it's really close in some places in Nova Scotia, but not quite there yet. On the other hand, if we get down to the near future, only a little cost drop all of a sudden starts making Nova Scotia economic to install solar residentially. It makes sense in Ontario as well, just because electricity prices there are relatively expensive. And really, you can see how Saskatchewan has lit up. So again, but cheap electricity from hydro in BC, Manitoba, and Quebec, and in Newfoundland. It really means that from a residential perspective, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to install solar. But again, all this stuff is on our website and it can be checked out. And then I'm going to flip to this slide as I slowly run out of time. Smart meters matter. And this is a big deal because what they can do is push arrays from uneconomic to economic. Again, solar generates electricity during the middle of a day when demand is highest. And if you're paying higher electricity prices because you're on a smart meter, then the electricity you generate on a solar array has higher value. And it really means that I'm going to go to, that's maybe not where I wanted to go. Go there. So for residential, what you can start seeing things is that, right, we have this graph and we have the different kinds of rates you pay, fixed rate and time of day rate by whatever province you're located in, right? So fixed rate, smart meter rate, and then we have the cost to install now, near future, and then a low cost future. And what you can see in each of these things is where you have a smart meter, immediately your economics get better. So that in a place like Nova Scotia, without a smart meter, right now, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to install solar. As soon as you drop a smart meter on there, you start getting a lot of communities where it makes sense. So this is important. Actually, Nova Scotia is rolling out smart meters through a lot of the province. Ontario, same thing, not quite there yet for residential solar, a fixed rate, but almost everywhere in Ontario has a smart meter. And all of a sudden, you can see all these things get economic. They drop below the your break-even price drops below the electricity price you're paying. So smart meters start mattering there. It takes about half of Saskatchewan that's uneconomic, and a smart meter, bang, makes it all economic. They do matter quite a bit. When you start looking in the future as well, same thing. You can see how smart meters drive down the break-even costs for solar power residentially. And then when I go to the commercial scale arrays, same thing here. You can see how in a place like Nova Scotia, half of it makes sense for commercial solar, half of it doesn't. When you're paying time of day rates, almost the entire province makes sense for commercial solar. Saskatchewan, for electricity, most of the province doesn't make a lot of sense when you're paying a fixed rate for your electricity price. When you put on smart meters on everything, it starts making economic sense. And by this, what could happen is because as provinces roll out smart meters, what we might see is higher adoption of solar at the residential, at commercial, at community scales, kind of thing. That might otherwise not happen if things just stayed at fixed rates. So smart meters matter a lot. That was one of the more interesting things of the study. They help solar a big deal. And so if you're going to get solar on a rooftop or for business, you might want to consider having a smart meter to go with it if you don't have one already. And I think because this ends in 13 minutes, I'm just going to go back to the presentation and go back to here. So the takeaway messages for today. Good solar potential doesn't always mean things make good financial sense. What really matters are provincial electricity prices you're paying. Are your break-even costs higher than that or lower than that? Smart meters improve financial break-evens. They can take an array and push it from not making financial sense to making financial sense. And I just want to get across again that every site is different, not only located across Canada, but also, again, that if you're considering doing this, always talk professional, get a site assessment, and have them run over the economics in some detail, because you just don't want to run off a report like this, which is based on some basic assumptions and could end up, in reality, what I used here could be different than what you would use on whatever site you would install your solar for. And that's my contact information on the screen. Our NEB website. Oh, there shouldn't be a dash here. That should actually be a period. So it should be neb-one.gc.ca. That's our website. From there, you can navigate to, this is the report, the economics of solar power in Canada. From there, again, you can get access to all those dashboards. You can search by name and just browse to your heart's content and go through all the different scenarios. They're all there, the cost scenarios, fixed rates, and smart meters, and so on. All right, and I'll hand this back over to June, or to 360 Energy, and we'll, if you have any questions, I can start to ask or answer them.
All right. Thanks very much for that presentation. We've got a lot of good information out of that. And we do have a bunch of questions to get through just on the chat here. So right off the bat, I'm going to just quickly come back from, okay. All right, so I'm just going to give you some questions if I could. So the first question I've got here, does the NEB offer or is considering offering any subsidies to install households or companies at this point?
Yeah, we, as a regulator, we don't do that. Right now, at the federal level, there is no plan to do that I've heard of. But that said, different provinces have different plans. Nova Scotia is rolling out one, which actually can help. You can imagine on the one chart that shows Nova Scotia. I'm going to go to the residential one. Here, Nova Scotia doesn't make a whole lot of sense, or it's pretty close right now at fixed rates, but they're rolling out a subsidy plan that will drop those costs to what a low-cost future would be, and bang, all of a sudden it makes financial sense to do solar in Nova Scotia. So Nova Scotia has a plan to, is rolling out some subsidies. Alberta currently has some subsidies, but a bunch of the subsidies that came off the table were in Manitoba. That happened recently. In Ontario, they came off the table recently. And I think in Quebec, too, they had some until 2017, and they don't have subsidies anymore. Right now, I think Nova Scotia and Alberta are the only places that have those subsidies in place.
Okay, great. So, got a couple more questions here. So, when you say break-even costs, over what time period are you meaning or looking at? Okay,
we're talking a 25-year life of the array. So that the assumption is that this array would be on your life and functioning for 25 years. The reasoning behind that is that that's generally the warranty on these things. So that over a 25-year period, if something goes wrong with the panel, they'll fix it free of cost. After 25 years, when things start going wrong, there's additional cost to get these things fixed. Now, some things, an array could last 30 years, but that wasn't done here. And also because things get discounted, the further you go in, because we did that discount rate thing, the further you go in the future, the less value it actually has when converted in today's dollars.
Great. So another question here. How does energy storage, in addition to solar, does that affect the break-evens at all?
It would. We didn't do that. The thing with energy storage, and it's interesting, the value of solar when you're generating on a rooftop or for a business is that it's generating during the day. So that's when electricity prices are highest if you're on a smart meter or paying time of use rates or whatever. Storage, on the other hand, right, it collects energy, it basically, it collects energy that if you're producing more electricity in your solar setup during the day, more than what your home needs, that excess electricity goes on your storage system. It's high value electricity getting put on your storage system, but then it gets discharged overnight when electricity prices are low, when you may actually be cheaper to buy electricity from the grid rather than use the electricity that you've generated at home on a solar array, excess to what your home needs. So solar is a bit tricky. We did not include it in this analysis. It would be really neat to do that. But again, because electricity prices can be lower overnight, it may just and that's when storage tends to discharge, it may make sense just to buy from the grid. But again, we have not done that analysis. And battery costs are falling, just as fast as solar costs. That right now may not make sense, but in a few years it might make sense.
Awesome, thanks. So we've got a ton of questions, and I'm going to just kind of give everybody a heads up. Probably not going to get through all of them today, but what we'll do is afterwards make some effort to get these answers out to everybody. Just kind of a heads up, we will be sending out everybody a link to the recording of today's webinar. We're still going to go through a few more questions, but there are quite a few questions, and I don't think we can answer all of them in the time allotted. So I'm just going to pick out a couple more here. Kind of already answered. So here's another question. Does the annual generation map take into account the capacity factor? So I think we're talking about capacity markets and the like that are obviously already in place in Ontario, and I know other jurisdictions are looking at it. So
yeah, we for utility scale, we did not do anything with regard to capacity markets, but all the generation we've got it's pure hourly. Because we can get that data from the NREL, it's based on hourly data. So anything that's in the generation map, it includes a capacity factor. It includes a capacity factor.
Okay, great. I've got another good question here. Did you convert your dollars per watt into dollars per gigajoule to compare to current natural gas costs? If so, are the electric... Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah. No, we didn't do that.
Okay. Then the part two of that question is not necessary. I think I'll just get a couple more. And Mike, I just want to, I've got just another question about, can you discuss where to find the Tableau maps on the OE or on the NEB website again?
Yeah. Do I still have control of the dashboard?
You do, yeah. I haven't taken it back yet.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to, okay, so our website is here. That's the thing. You go to, well, English or French. You can do it either. It's available in both languages. If you go to Energy Information, that's our program. And once you're on Energy Information, we really don't have a good navigatable website. Once you Energy Information, you should be able to get there. Usually I don't have to go to my own website to find it. I have all the data on my own. Statistics and analysis. Okay, there we go. So if you go to our home website, Energy Information, Statistics and Analysis, Electricity, and we should be right there, Analysis, Economics of Solar Power in Canada.
Great.
Which gets you to the report.
So could I make a suggestion, Mike? Maybe what we can do is when we're answering the questions, we can send that complete link along with it so people can quickly get there.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to pick out one more question here. Can a homeowner or business submit a request to the NEB to run the model based on their particular situation? So kind of, I guess, just sort of get some help with running things on their own.
I'm really hesitant to do that. This is where the thing where I'm not professional sort of, but I mean, I'm not like a solar professional.
Right.
And the risk is I don't want to give out bad advice. Usually the better way to do this, you might want to get a couple of quotes from different providers.
Great. I appreciate that. It's good advice. So I apologize. Originally, we were going to kind of open it up for verbal questions, but we're kind of running out of time. I did say I would share the poll with you, the results. So just kind of a little bit of an idea of where today. There's people from actually pretty much all kind of categories here today, definitely. So really hoping that everybody within those categories and without had a good, got something out of today's presentation here. So without any further ado, and I do apologize, I wish we had time for more questions, but as I said, we're going to take stock of those questions and then work to get those answers out to everybody, along with the link to the presentation, and also a link to the NED. But without any further ado, thank you so much, Mike, for your time today and for putting this presentation together for everybody. I thought there's quite a lot of good information in there today.
Yeah, thanks. My pleasure.
All right. Well, without any further ado, we're going to shut things off. But thanks everybody here for attending today, and we'll be in touch shortly again with links and answers to the rest of those questions. Thanks once again for your time and attending today, and we'll be talking to you soon. Thank you.